staying atop of the game because it's changing so quickly. It is crazy.
Nice. I'm trying to start the restream, so I think we should be going live soon.
Awesome.
Let's see.
There he is. How's it going, Satiris? We can't hear you just yet.
So yeah, okay. Let's see. How do you feel about? Well, maybe we can jump straight into it, Thomas. How do you feel about markets, or are you aping into anything right now? Not at all giving a segue into my Chainlink position.
Um, so it's an odd one, right? So I feel that things are still quite volatile, and I think that we are going to be range bound until we find a resolution. Um, well, I say we until the US finds a resolution
No, no,
with the.
us totally. It all comes down to the chain reactions gang.
Just give us a few more
Yeah,
weeks,
yeah, yeah.
guys. We're on it. No, and I think so. That sort of is both a if you will, like a put, because there's sort of negotiations are ongoing. So I don't think we can go that much lower. But at the same time, the upside is limited greatly. And ultimately, that leaves us with, I think, a very, very interesting dichotomy. In terms of, well, is it good to get exposure? How much worse can it get? And the answer is obviously the longer this sort of goes on, the more it deteriorates, right?
Yeah.
So, and from that perspective, I feel it's still not quite, we're still not quite there. But if there is a resolution or even like a real ceasefire, then I think it makes time to sort of add to exposure. But and I'm not necessarily long term bearish at all. I'm just not sure if we're quite ready to uh, enter exposure, yes, but get like properly exposed. I think we're still far away from that. If that makes sense.
But so in terms of like practical allocation, are you buying? Are you waiting? Are you kind of selling? Are you doing something a bit more structured with options? Like how are you thinking about that?
hmm So I think at the moment it's still quite attractive to actually sell upside. So whether that's through options or structured
Mm.
products, I feel that's the way to go, and rather short date it because we are in a very very
Yeah,
dynamic environment.
yeah.
Um, and that means ultimately you sell a bit of upside over like a shorter term, which is fine because by the time we will get to a proper resolution, there's probably that the reallocation, the risk on process is going to take at least a week or two. So whilst there is going to be this initial sort of jump, ultimately there is still time to sort of get back into the game, and that's
Mm.
how I think about it at the moment.
And so the selling upside, what does it look like? Are you selling calls at like
Mhm.
higher strike prices?
Correct.
Yeah.
For this is basically equities mainly, and that's the
Oh,
way
okay.
to. So in terms of an investable universe, you want something that's volatile but isn't going to be necessarily disrupted by AI next week. Um, Although that kind of does help, but it doesn't help in terms of the upside being kept. Therefore, the premiums that one can earn on them is are going to be lower, right? So from that perspective, you want something that generally is relatively future proof, but is being questioned at the moment. So that selling the upside is going to is giving you this the premiums that I feel are better to sort of cash in now because again a lot of the upside is only going to be had once we have this resolution. So selling the upside is I think the way to go about it. But that said, that's not obviously my entire portfolio,
No, no,
but
of
rather
course.
a small satellite, if you will.
Yeah.
And again, I think with the current environment, especially, we're quite range bound, which is prime for these sort of strategies.
And short dated, is it like in a few weeks or are you
Oh,
looking?
not at all. Less than 7 days.
Oh,
So
right.
anywhere like 3 to 5 days. That's I feel the
Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Makes
the,
sense.
the, the best way to go
Otherwise, I was
about it. Yeah.
I was trying to make sense of it while you were explaining it, and I was like, well, selling upside on like let's say something 3 or 4 weeks out feels risky, basically. But yeah.
Oh, for sure. No, that's yeah, that's a bit risky. I think to play the other side as well because I'm again, there's somewhat of a floor that we're seeing. So I think equally it is a good time to sell puts
But yeah,
in order to get exposure quite cheaply. So ultimately, that's selling insurance to somebody. If the
yeah,
stock is at 100 today, you can buy that stock, or ultimately insure somebody if that stock were to, say, fall below 80. And at that point, you would need to buy that stock at $80. And that's again with a lot of these businesses that are heavily well, that are going to be disrupted for sure, but the extent to which I think is being a bit overdone.
yeah.
So from that perspective, that helps with that sort of with cheap accumulation, and but at the same time with the assets that I hold, I think the upside is quite limited at the minute. So from that perspective, playing it quite range bound, looking to see what I can accumulate.
Yeah, makes sense. Satiris, sorry, I feel like you were on mute when we were saying hi and kind of catching up, but how are you doing and what do you
Oh,
think about all that?
can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. It feels a little bit echoey,
Oh,
but no, I think it's okay actually.
okay.
Sorry, my bad.
Ah,
No, no, it's good. It's good.
nice. Yeah, yeah. Yeah. What a few weeks in the market. It feels like volatility has just the volatility of crypto has basically spilled over to equities since Trump's term. It's quite reminiscent of sort of all of the tariff FUD and just how quickly now markets can whipsaw even just on a headline. And so I think trying to trade these conditions is pretty tricky. You're mostly just going to get chopped up. And so I think it's probably been a good opportunity to add if you've had the dry powder. I've had a nibble of a couple of positions as well. Um, I'm probably taking a slight opposite side of Thomas on um, famous last words, but I think the worst might be behind us. I feel there was sort of like max FUD a couple of weeks ago, and even with the sort of ongoing escalations up until Trump's sort of 2 week extension yesterday, um, the markets weren't really buying the FUD anymore, it seemed. If you look at kind of the big index funds, they put in at least a local bottom um, a couple of weeks ago now, nearly. And so I think that's been quite an interesting point of sort of dislocation in price action and then all of the doom and gloom you're hearing in the headlines. Um, yeah, could this continue escalating? I'm not sure. I feel Trump pretty much wants a way out. It seems. I think Israel is pretty bloodthirsty at all times, and so I think they'll do whatever they can to kind of keep stoking the fire. And so I think that's sort of the biggest unknown at this point. But ultimately, though, I think the world wants to see this get resolved a lot sooner than later. And just as a little snippet of how markets have reacted so far on the news of a 2 week extension, you saw like a pretty resounding bounce across the board. And so I just feel that's like maybe a sign of like pent up demand. And I feel there's like been so much like negativity and negative sentiment around like, oh, the AI bubble is like popping, it's like a top and all of this. And it's probably oversimplistic, but I've said before that I feel we had such a sort of risking off period from late 21, 22, all the way through most of 23. And we had this like huge drawdown, especially in tech. And to only be like 2 or 3 years out of that, and then now we've put in like the mother of all tops, and we're about to experience a Great Depression level crash because of an oil spike. It doesn't make sense to me. So I'm still long. Maybe it's a horrible mistake, but I still remain pretty bullish. But we'll see.
But also, I feel like throughout our conversations, we can't fade your sentiment analysis. So I think you're quite plugged in, like maybe more than Thomas and I are. And so I'm like, if you feel like there's been too much bearishness and that this is a good opportunity, I feel like it's probably not wrong. But then the question is always like how does it play out over time, right? Because there's so many things that can happen, and or maybe delayed reactions that can take place. So yeah, but it's interesting because I feel like when we're talking about markets, we're talking about macro markets and less so about necessarily Bitcoin, because you were talking about the volatility, and I really don't know how to frame it, but I do feel like there's volatility, like up and down, with people being bullish or bearish depending on headlines. And at the same time, you look at the price of Bitcoin, and it's like the most range bound than we've seen in a long time, right? At least for the past 2 weeks, where it's like 67, 72K. It's kind of that range. And we're just hovering in there, and nobody's willing to go to 75K. Nobody's willing to take it down to the lower 60Ks either. And it's like, it's there basically waiting, to do something. So
And you've got the new sort of the bid mechanism now with STRC, and so I think that's been a sort of pretty interesting timing push, a bit of selling pressure as well. So the new sort of micro strategy,
oh right, yeah,
like yield bearing structural product.
yeah, yeah.
Michael Saylor is the sort of financial alchemist, it seems, where he can just kind of create these like infinite money loops. But I do think as well, it adds a bit of sort of decorrelation for Bitcoin, where because this product is offering an 11% yield, that's pretty appealing for a lot of people, especially in a slightly more risk-off environment. And then anytime you have increased demand for this yield product, any surplus is then used to funnel back and buy Bitcoin. And so in the last couple of days, they've been buying sort of 600 Bitcoin a day. I think yesterday it was 2,000 Bitcoin. And that's at least helping absorb some of the selling pressure. And I think they'll kind of continue growing, which is quite interesting.
Yeah, makes sense. Thomas, what do you think about the whole MicroStrategy thing? And also, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think some DATs have actually been selling some of their Bitcoins, or some of their Ethereum. But it's not like massive, but it's just like one of the smaller ones. So not the MetaPlanet and not MicroStrategy, of course, but some like smaller digital asset treasury companies have been selling like a third of something, and then you've got the miners also selling. And so I'm like, I don't know if these two forces kind of balance each other out and it has no impact, or if it should have an impact. Right now in price, I feel like again we're range bound, so I don't think it's having that much of an impact. But yeah. Have we lost you, Thomas?
Just
Oh,
well, if Thomas was that,
I'm not sure who.
sorry.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure.
Move forward.
Sorry, Satir. So
Yeah,
what are you saying? Is there like a delay or?
I think we've got a bit of a lag, but I'm just not sure who. I thought it was me at first, but it looks like it's probably like a bit of everyone. But can you hear me now? Because then
Yeah, we can hear you.
take your question. I can at least hear sort of the first part I heard you were talking about DATs, but I think and generally about MicroStrategy's yield bearing product, which is great financial engineering, right? I think generally they've designed these products really well. I generally think that we'll see a lot more of these structured type products because they are generally it's a few derivatives sort of nicely packaged, but ultimately that leads to these products being very, very straightforward and sort of limited as to what the upside and downside exposure is. So from that perspective, I think it's quite interesting. But I think the real story lies also in those, and you touched on this as well, as to what the miners are doing, and they're doing a fair bit of capitulation at the moment, which would ultimately underline Satiris's point that is that we've sort of found a local bottom, and that we are. I mean, again, I think in terms of local bottom as well. Now, if we look at previous drawdowns from the top all the way down to the bottom, we would have seen anywhere between 90 to 75 and percent of a drawdown, which I think is at least on the 75%, that would be not entirely unrealistic. We've drawn down about 50%, which is also quite large already. So from that perspective, I think that plus the minor story, plus the general sentiment, which is quite weird in a way because we went from utter devastation essentially just a few weeks ago into whilst we're in this crazy volatile high geopolitical risk environment, and we've actually seen an improvement in the sentiment for crypto markets. So I think from that perspective, it could certainly be a bottom. And yeah, so I think the minor story is the likes of Marathon, but there's a few others that are now pursuing other revenue streams, which generally I think makes sense to sort of diversify it. We're seeing a lot of innovation still in the miners. I think Bitmain just came out with a new miner that sort of record-breakingly efficient. So from that perspective, I think we're still going to see quite a bit of that. But yeah, so I think that could be a good sign. Not sure. You did want to touch on another point, Justin, with DATs. I'm not sure what that was, but I'd love to hear what point you're making.
I don't remember the name of the companies, but I know that some DATs have actually been selling Bitcoin, basically. So
Right.
so you've got MicroStrategy, and then I guess MetaPlanet, that are buying, and they've been consistently buying. But I think some smaller DATs have actually been selling some of their holdings, and I think that kind of shifts the narratives with those companies that should be holding the asset forever and only accumulating. And so it's like it puts pressure on the markets. Clearly, not enough to depress prices, in the lower 60K. So we're still kind of in range, but I guess it's not good. And then another point I wanted to talk about, which I think is being talked about a lot, is the quantum threat, right? And how we get out of it, and how soon it comes, and how impactful it is. Again, I think that in terms of prices, hasn't really affected much, but I do think it's something that needs to be talked about.
So Tiers, why don't you start us off? Because I think you'll be a lot more plugged in than probably we are.
Yeah.
Plus, the mic is in.
Is this better now?
It is better, actually. Yeah.
Okay. The mic was sat on the other side of the table. I've got two mics, and so I
Oh,
was speaking into the wrong
wait. Can you talk into the other mic again?
one. Testing 1, 2, 3.
Wow, that is way better.
Testing.
No, the other one is way better.
Oh, this one is better?
Yeah, this one is
Oh, okay.
insanely good. Yeah.
Okay, good to know. Sorry, this fucking thing is having a nightmare. But yeah, so with quantum though, I think it's a very real, increasingly real risk factor. Google have just sort of announced like a new sort of expedited timeline that they feel sort of quantum is posing a real threat in the next sort of 5 years. And prior to that, it was looking at about 10-year time horizon. A lot of these sort of algorithms as well that can be used to crack some types of encryption, like RSA, for example, are getting more efficient as well. And so now the number of qubits required to actually perform these calculations is also decreasing due to sort of algorithmic efficiencies. You pair that with the advancements in AI now as well, I feel it's going to really sort of expedite development across multiple fronts. And so I think the threat of quantum is going to come quicker than people imagine. I do still think, though, if quantum is a real risk, crypto is obviously the most vulnerable, or potentially the most vulnerable, but the whole sort of global system is also a threat as well. So there's probably bigger issues at hand. However, for something like Bitcoin, just from a narrative perspective, I think it could sort of loom over it like a sort of Damocles almost. With Bitcoin now, though, because you have sort of Michael Saylor being the sort of bearer of the sort of project now, trying to take over from Satoshi, essentially, I think it's in his interest to make sure they push through sort of
some updates to make Bitcoin quantum secure sooner rather than later. I do think this will be a period of sort of a lot of uncertainty, and so part of FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And so I could imagine it's not going to be great for the price action of Bitcoin, probably similar to the block size wars where you had sort of Bitcoin Cash and all of this being forked out because people had different directions they want to take things. And so I do think there will be sort of difficulty in finding consensus around that. But with quantum, ultimately the writing's on the wall. But at the same time, I think Bitcoin is now such a huge asset class. It's got such institutional adoption. It's in too many people's best interest to not address this threat sooner rather than later. And so I do think it will get addressed and ultimately be a nothing burger. But might it provide some sort of opportunities to buy a dip? I think so. I think the bigger threat imminently, though, is probably these latest AI models. And so you've got the sort of Anthropic model that they're not even wanting to publicly release yet because they deem it's too strong and too much of a cybersecurity threat, because they're running it and they're finding all of these like zero-day exploits and a bunch of like not even like crypto projects, just like Web 2 projects and devices and things like that. And so it's going to potentially present quite a sort of a security threat for a lot of projects, both in the world of crypto and outside of that. And so I think that's probably going to draw more attention in the short term. And then every time Google updates a new quantum breakthrough, it kind of reminds everyone, oh shit, we should probably look at sort of quantum secure cryptography. One project that I would like to shill, I don't have a bag or anything, but I know the founder and they've got some good backers, is Qantas. And they've got Balaji as one of the backers, which is a pretty big name in the space. And so I think they're probably one to keep an eye on, where they're creating a sort of quantum secure first blockchain and trying to essentially be the ZEC, how like Zcash is to privacy. They're trying to be that for quantum secure security.
Isn't there, there's on that very note, isn't there something about Zcash already kind of being quantum resistant? Or is it near? There's some old chains that are kind of okay with that. So yeah.
It's not officially, it's not like technically quantum proof. And so if you look at the official ZEC messaging and infrastructure, they themselves are not saying it's quantum secure. But a lot of sort of bag holders and chillers of Zcash are trying to kind of peddle that narrative. And so it's like, yeah, it's a step in the right direction, but it's not actually quantum secure.
Okay. Interesting.
Yes, they are. I can speak to that. So essentially, the mathematical proof systems that they're using are ZK Starks, and ultimately that is mathematically a great way to ultimately divert a lot of the computational power by just cranking up the work that needs to be put in. Now, that is where, obviously, so from a mathematical standpoint and from a sort of procedural standpoint, they're prepared. There's a fewer upgrades effectively needed in order to get them over the line. And if you look at the distance that they are away from getting there, as opposed to other protocols that are on the optimistic side or are generally not relying on mathematical proofs, right, or on proofs in general, then that's obviously that will require a lot more of a technical lift in order to get there. And so that's that may be definitely one way in order to sort of sort through a token list if one wants to generally get exposure to that. I do also still recall there's actually. And this is not a recommendation or anything, but this was years back. There was Quantum, which I think was even one of those blockchains. May have been 6 years ago, may have been longer ago.
Yeah.
But so and again, it now gets kind of really interesting because with all of these things that are now happening, which is almost coming from both ways. You've got your more like this way, both ways. You've got your underlying systems, the Macs, the Mac OS. You've got Linux. You've got Windows, which are now currently. That they're finding exploits that are like 27 years old, which is pretty scary. But at the same time, we've got this sort of uncertainty introduced through the efficiencies that we're seeing in the quantum space, which is pretty scary. And I think generally, from a blockchain as a whole perspective, I think there needs to be a very very different approach going forward. Since a lot of the tokens are still self-custodied, so from that perspective, that's going to be quite challenging in order to keep users safe, right? And that's pretty wild. And I think it's only a matter of time. I hope I'm wrong. Until sort of blockchains will be completely hacked. If we have models that are this sort of powerful, then blockchains aren't necessarily going to be hacked directly, but the attack vector is going to be bridges, right? And that ultimately can dilute all assets on a certain blockchain. And I'm curious as to whether or not that's something that that we'll see over the next like couple of months or the next years. So I think we'll see a major shift from like white paper tech to actual tech in order to protect digital assets.
Can I just add one very quick point to what Thomas is saying? So I do think the whole vulnerability side is a huge factor. There is something to consider as well, where it's like the time of attack and then the time of like patching and solving and creating better infrastructure. And so these very powerful AIs are good at identifying vulnerabilities that have sort of not been addressed yet. But at the same time, I imagine a lot of companies will be using this very powerful AI to also harden their own systems relatively quickly. Mm-hmm. And so I do think it's not sort of this like complete doomsday for all of crypto where now everyone's helpless and everything's going to get hacked eventually. It will be this sort of back and forth, but I think once it launches, it's probably quicker for an attacker to find a vulnerability than it is for a blockchain to like audit and refactor all of their code, test it, and then post a more secure one. So I think short term, probably more vulnerable. Long term, I think it might find more of an equilibrium.
Yeah, no, that I think makes perfect sense. And it's how quickly that can be patched up, and also I think so. This model has obviously been distributed to I think 50 of the largest or most sort of influential IT companies. Now the question is, in terms of that distribution, is that going to be done, correctly, or is it simply based on market cap, based on and what are the how is value that needs to be protected being assessed? And so that I think is going to be important because not every, I feel, important company or protocol for that for the sake of this as well. If we're looking at DeFi protocols, yield sort of protocols, that's going to be really, really quite tricky to distribute that in time. And also, I think from an affordability perspective, I think the cost of running such a model are easy. I think in the billions, which makes sense in a very, very large commercial setting. Like if Microsoft is addressing some bugs, that certainly there's a lot of commercial value that's being protected. So for Microsoft to splash a few $100 million on this is an absolute no-brainer. But for a smaller or even not so small DeFi protocol thinking Aave, I'm not sure as to what their budget is for such things. And certainly, I doubt that there are no vulnerabilities. And I don't want to be a doomsday speaker. I just feel that this is definitely a risk that that needs to be taken into account when we're talking about capital allocation. Especially as we're moving into this decentralized world a little bit more, although it almost feels like we're rolling a little bit back with our banks obviously offering these services, which is not what really the space is about, but essentially from a consumer protection perspective, is a much more elegant fashion, because there's less exposure that private individuals have to this, and this is something that can be rolled back, as opposed to real world blockchain transactions.
By the way, on the note of the cost to run this model, like, have you seen data on this, or are you just assuming that because it's so much more powerful, it's going to cost that much to run things on it or through
I
it?
think so. 2 data points there. I'm pretty sure I saw earlier that the cost of this model was like $1 billion, and I think also Mark Andreessen just posted an interesting, essentially different pricing tiers for AI, and it was your typical like $50, $100, $200, all the way up to $1 billion, which in 2026 isn't all that much anymore, it appears. But yeah, so I think there is some. If somebody like Mark Andreessen puts this number forward, I don't technically feel that this is completely unrealistic. Might not be $1 billion, might be millions for sure, or tens or hundreds of millions, but I do believe that running this is going to be substantial in cost terms.
Do you think it's kind of I'm kind of switching away a bit from Bitcoin and blockchains, but do you think this is like the most impactful, or like a catalysis for AI and the impact it's going to have on the world? Or is it just like super narrow because it's focused on mostly coding, and so mostly large companies and security, but not really affecting the day-to-day life, of people? Because I can't help but project myself in the future and think, so far what we've seen is all the models become cheaper and more efficient. So ultimately, this kind of capability can be applied to a lot of things outside of necessarily just coding, and be applied to a lot of just normal human beings. And so, like, is it so powerful that it really does replace, humans in the value chain?
I can do a first pass on this. I think it's multifaceted, and so when it comes to the current sort of approach of AI, or at least the most dominant models, they're using large language models, and so coding is based on language, especially modern coding that's not just ones and zeros. All of it is just written in moderately human legible code, and so it's a very natural fit for these large language models to kind of already excel at. And then you've also got this added sort of setup where the people making these AI models are themselves programmers and coders and developers. And so they're going to know their own industry the most intimately, and they're going to want to sort of make solutions for themselves first, because it then creates this feedback loop that makes them more efficient and kind of gets to their goals quicker. And so you've got this amazing sort of flywheel effect when it comes to software. And so I think that's why we're seeing most of the sort of advancements in real world application hitting the sort of software level first. I do think, though, it's only a matter of time once people sort of wake up to what's possible with these systems that are always getting better as well, and then start applying them to other sort of knowledge-based verticals and domains. You are already seeing this, where AI is being applied to almost every industry now, and every vertical that has some form of sort of knowledge work, or anything you can essentially do via a computer. AI is going to be able to sort of at least help in part, or do completely, or do in a completely different way that's way better than humans could have ever envisioned. And so I think any kind of computer-based knowledge work, I don't think is sort of safe from AI, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. If AI can make knowledge work more efficient and give the world sort of not just better technical solutions, but better biomedical solutions, better healthcare diagnostics, like better efficiency in sort of like fuel usage, engine design, better like mechanical designs for solar panels or spacecraft or whatever, it's like, it's just gonna, I think, be a boon to humanity. As long as there's still some people who have money to buy stuff, if everyone's been replaced. But I think, at least in the short term, civilizations are quite slow to adapt. And so the technology can be moving very quickly, but to go around and get every business to kind of actually use AI is like a whole nother thing. And so I think you can kind of look at what's happening in the frontier labs and in Silicon Valley, and it feels like everything's moving at breakneck speed, which it kind of is. But then at the same time, it might take the sort of small dental clinic like quite a few years to kind of catch up, just because the way they're doing things isn't really broken, and so they're kind of happy to just trundle along as they are. With regards to like another point of just like human labor and dislocation there, I think that will come later once we have sort of more advancements in humanoid robotics or robotics in general. And we're seeing some really impressive strides now in the control systems that are now being driven by AI to control these robots. But I do think that's a longer time horizon before we start to see sort of the robots taking the blue collar jobs. But at the same time, I think it's moving quick, but it's also going to take a while to implement.
But aren't most jobs white collar jobs rather than blue collar jobs anyway? So it's like, I mean, I think we can put taxi driver and cars, on its own thing because it's kind of like a weird, robot but not robot. But in terms of all the job displacement that are going to happen for lawyer, medical, customer service, translator, language, education, blah blah blah, I feel like that's already quite impactful. And by the way, I totally agree with you that I think it's going to take several years to play out, right? Even more than just a couple of years, right? Because like we think about a Hong Kong banking system, you still have like paper signatures, and stuff like that, even though there's easier ways to do it. So it does take time for organization to adjust. But I'm like, I think just so much job displacement already in the next 5 years, just on software engineers, coding, customer support, anything that can be done on a computer, kind of.
But before Thomas jumps in, maybe just to sort of button up what I was saying, I do feel there is going to be displacement in the US and in developed worlds. White collar jobs are, I think, quite a lot more sort of dominant, but that's not to say that'll always be the case, where maybe the nature of work shifts again, like it did during the sort of industrial and agricultural revolutions, where everyone was farmers and then they sort of go more into factories, and now they've gone from factories into knowledge work. And so maybe if AI is doing knowledge work, we actually need more people hands-on again, building the data centers. So maybe just the nature of jobs will shift. And then also, I do think the actual level of displacement might not be as high as people seem. It's just jobs might end up changing a little bit. And so a doctor, instead of being a diagnostic expert, the AI will probably be able to diagnose the human's condition way more accurately. But someone will still want to go see a doctor who has the medical training, who can still be sort of a human sounding board in time of need. Similarly with like a lawyer, like I'm not sure if you're in deep trouble, you're going to just trust sort of your chat GPT response. You're still going to want that in-person thing. And that's where I think the sort of societal norms will be a lot slower to change.
But I think it can change like much faster than a lot of people think, for example. So if you told me, well, just like let's use the car as an example, right? If you tell me the car driving itself is 99%, better than, or does 99% less mistakes than a human, I'm like, I'll actually feel safer in a self-driving car, right? And so it's like, maybe the human sounding board. I think it's a conversation I have a lot of times when people talk about therapists, where it's like, oh, but it's such a human thing, to be listened and the empathy and so on. And I'm like, I think for a portion of the population, yes, but for a big portion of the population, if you tell me the AI is a better trained, has read more things, is updated in real time, costs a fraction of the price, and is available 24/7, sure, I kind of appreciate the human thing, but I'll still go for the non-human interaction, right? And you can duplicate that for your hairdresser, your doctor, your lawyer, or maybe it's one lawyer that's handling so much more and just coming at the very end of the value chain or whatever it is, right? And so, yeah, I don't think humans are safe just because of the human connection aspect, but that's it.
Yeah, so it sounds like we're pretty doomed. I think there's two aspects to it though, and I think in terms of that like distribution between being mentally retarded or on a super IQ basis. I think the crux of everything is going to be you cannot build businesses unless you've got extra consumption. And so what we're seeing globally is the minute the sort of business climate cools down, that's due to demand, right? And then we see this sort of trickle down into in financial terms. We see this based on sectors, right? So first, there's a high degree of discretionary spending that's being abandoned, right, by large businesses. Well, that's new data centers, new technology. So we can kind of see how that's affected, which is then going to trickle down into the workers that work there, which aren't going to be consuming as much, and then generally the sentiment will drop, and that will then ultimately trickle down to all industries, and it will definitely depress discretionary spending, and that's called a depression, right? In cycle terms. So I feel that there's this like super simplistic approach where so you can't have 100 kings on earth and everybody else is living in poverty, because if you have 100 kings, then they would need to take care of themselves, which what's the point in that, right? And obviously you can have humanoids sort of do that for you at that point, which would be sort of the counter argument of it. But I think it would still be a pretty doomsday scenario if there wouldn't be a way to cater for both. Now, what that looks like, I'm not quite sure, but ultimately one could make the case. Obviously, I work in finance, so I'll take spreadsheets as an example, right? So when at some point the calculator got retired, and we're now using pretty advanced spreadsheet software that on its own is creating a bunch of jobs because which aren't necessarily necessary, because at some point you just have people maintain models, people maintain certain things that were built 15 years ago, but because Gary did this thing, but he never explained it to everyone, so they have to just make sure that the thing doesn't break. So that's why you've got like your 150 step list that you're having to go through in order to do anything. So I think that's certainly one way of looking at it. But what that's going to look like is hard to say. I think Bill Gates once said, so the impact is overestimated on a 5-year basis and underestimated on a 10-year basis. I think that sounds pretty right. But if we look back just for sort of the last 3 years, ChatGPT came out in November 2022. Up until now, it's been pretty crazy as to where we are. But I feel we're still sort of looking for that product market fit. I mean, obviously, there's a wide array of things that can be done, but we do need to see as to how that sort of pans out. I think the first $1 billion business that is run by a guy and his brother. We've seen obviously that's pretty crazy, so it can be done, but that's also probably a stars aligned sort of business idea. But again, and conversely, that might also increase people's ability to set up businesses, right? So I think from that perspective, it's really, really difficult to say. And unfortunately, you're not talking to an AI, but just me. So I'm having trouble like going through so many like iterations and possibilities.
Just a couple of points I'd like to riff off that Thomas sort of raised. One, I fully agree. This is a question I've also been coming back to myself. So where's the demand ultimately going to come from? If everyone's getting replaced and out of a job, then who's going to buy stuff? And so I do think that is a concern. A slight counter argument to that is I'm not sure if it's going to be this sort of switch where suddenly everyone's employed, then suddenly everyone's out of a job because they've been replaced by AI, and now like demand has just ceased. I do think the sort of dynamics of economies are also going to shift, and it's going to be very deflationary because AI is going to make things cheaper and cheaper. Because if you can have a system or a robot make something and you don't need to pay a human, it means you can probably produce that thing for less money, which means you can offer it for a lower price. And then if you're not offering it for a lower price, someone else can make it and offer it for a lower price. And there's kind of this race to the bottom. And you've seen this in some technology. So the cost of a television, for example, has come way down. And the cost of like the actual sort of technology and the manufacturing has meant that before a TV was a luxury item, and now anyone has a TV, basically, even in sort of the developing world. And so I do think you might see that sort of shift start to happen with a lot of products and services. And so maybe healthcare gets a lot cheaper for people, maybe legal advice gets a lot cheaper and things like that as well. But then I do think that doesn't fully address the like, well, if everyone's out of a job, even if stuff's cheaper, what happens? Maybe we transition to a more socialist economy where because everything is so cheap now, it's actually more affordable for the government just to provide all the basic needs for humanity at a much lower cost, which you're maybe starting to see in China as well, because they've been sort of in this deflationary spiral because they manufacture everything. And so there's a lot of competition and pushing prices way down. So I think that was like one sort of item. I still haven't figured it out personally, but it's just something I'm constantly grappling with. But I think at the very least, there's going to be a sort of transitionary period where sort of the demand and purchasing is slipping as more people are out of a job. But then if the price of stuff is also coming down, that might absorb some of the shock. But then, yeah, I hope it's not just like 100 billionaires with all the money and we're just the permanent underclass. I'm not sure. Justin, any thoughts?
No, but the one thing I was going to say is I feel like you all know how capitalistic, I can be or how my ideals are. But I do feel like AI and the dynamic you're talking about is maybe the only thing that would make me somewhat socialist. As in, I could imagine a world where if, I guess, like resources and production is so cheap, and if you can imagine a government that is organized mostly by AI, so all the inefficiencies of a centralized, entity that is trying to redistribute resources, but is liable to fraud and corruption and inefficiencies and human error and so on, all of that is kind of taken away. I'm not opposed, to the idea of things being redistributed equally, because we end up at a point where humanity is just a very different concept than it was 10 years ago or 100 or 1,000 years ago, right? And so I'm not saying that I'm vouching or that I'm rooting for that or that I think it will happen, but I'm just saying that's maybe the only setup where I think it kind of makes sense, because as long as there's a competitive nature to production and resources or like scarce resources, I think a centralized entity as a government that then redistributes stuff is always going to be inefficient or always going to lead to inequalities, no matter how they would try to negate inequalities. But I think AI actually might lead us to a world where it's like, look, you don't really need to do much, and things are very available. On that note, I actually just finished a book that was recommended by Elon Musk and also another guy, Dwarkesh, I think, is the name, on a podcast that they were talking about, which is called The Culture series, and it's written by a British guy, and so it's like
Ian M. Banks.
games. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Did you read Consider Fleabag, the first one?
No, I read the second one, Players of Game.
Okay.
Which apparently is like
nice.
the best one in the whole
Yeah.
series, and they were like, you don't have to follow one another, so just go for that. But so the whole point is, it does describe this kind of millennia in the future type of civilization where there are no laws and there are no jobs, because it's like, you want a house, here's a house. You want to travel, go travel. You want to talk to someone, talk to and so it's there. I think that's very idealistic and utopic, of course, but I don't know. I thought it was interesting, intellectually speaking. That's all.
And I just, again, to kind of bounce off that, I do sort of idealize about this sort of utopic, sort of post-resource scarcity future that I do think AI can bring about. And then ultimately, I think people will still choose to work and like do things, but it just won't be a necessity for them to survive. And I think ultimately, I don't want to see a world where people are like starving to death and not getting medical treatment. It's like, why wouldn't you want a world where everyone's got like a high standard of living? And so I think sort of aspirationally, I would love to see that sort of future be realized. One just thought, I'm not even sure like what to go with this, but maybe you guys can also riff on it. It's like, I can see a future where even companies are just being like completely driven by AI. And so humans are just completely out of the loop. because it's way more efficient for these like super intelligent AI systems just to run everything. Like humans are slow. Even Elon Musk was saying you wouldn't want a human calculating a couple of cells on a spreadsheet when the rest of the spreadsheet is just updating automatically, and you've got some like chimp with a calculator trying to like work out their part. And so having humans in the loop might actually be sort of a real like bottleneck for these companies. But then it begs the question, if the nature of AI becomes just these AI companies, do they then serve humans or do they serve other AIs? And then what does like an AI economy look like? And like, will there be an AI economy? I'm sure there will be. It's like if AIs need something from other AIs or some niche or specialty, but then it's like, do we then have this sort of like strata where you've got AI billionaire, trillionaire sort of economies and their own sort of super powerful AIs doing their own thing? And then what does it look like for humanity? Do we just have the sort of dumb, non-sentient AIs making our life a bit better, and then all the really super powerful AIs have just sort of transcended humanity, and maybe they give us some crumbs if they look down upon us favorably as their creators, or we just become so small in comparison, we look like bacteria to them as bacteria looks to us, kind of thing. But you just don't even think about it. It's like, it's just bacteria is just like not something we kind of would even consider trying to interact with, unless you take antibiotics, obviously. But yeah, I don't know. I feel like we could live in that sort of weird time where you get this bifurcation of sort of AI helping humanity, but then AI also just doing its own thing and leaving us in the dust. But maybe that's just the world we're in now, so it might not be too bad.
Leaving us with recreational work. That's a weird thought. If I had to bet, I would probably go. So one point is simply obviously the cost of TV screens. That's probably that's sort of in a way nitpicking, because that's one of those items that got cheaper, right? And obviously, if we're looking at other items, they actually got a lot more expensive. If we take our vanilla iPhone, that has been essentially the same for the last 15 years. A bit harsh, but just, Tim Cook, if you're listening, crank it up a bit. But ultimately, so that's obviously gotten a lot more expensive. Services have gone up in price. And I think it will come down to this physical bottleneck that at the moment is oil and fuel. And I think specifically, well, sort of the biggest bottleneck there is tankers and is essentially aeroplanes. With their inability to sort of fly electric, right? Because it's just the economics, the physiognomics don't make sense. And I think from that perspective, that's going to be quite an interesting thing. But if I were to bet, I would bet against this UBI type economy, because that also doesn't work, and it never quite worked in the past. It always needs this sort of ultimately there's always going to be competition, and nobody likes other people having more than them or the same as them if they don't work as much, and that's a very subjective thing. So that's why I think it will not work, but maybe we will have to serve our AI overlords, or lizard overlords for that matter.
I'm just showing a chart directly to what you were just saying about, Thomas, where things like the cost of DVs has come down, but interestingly, services have all massively increased in price. And so how do you see that changing in a world with more AI, for example? Do you think this balance might start to shift, or do you think this is just like the trend and it will continue? As services get more efficient to spend, their profit margins go up. And
by the way, it's not just services, right? Housing, food and beverage, college textbook, those are not services, those are actual goods.
Yeah, so I think that's somewhat correlated, right? But yeah, so I think if we look at the bluish items, I generally think the AI is extremely deflationary, because it should bring down the cost of everything, right? Medical services, college tuition as well. An AI teacher might be able to cater or an AI might be able to cater a lot more to somebody's needs than sort of any teach in front of 30, 40, 50 people could ever be. And I think a lot of the top is simply driven by inflation, which is pricing. So ultimately, if you take humans out of the equation, it should become a lot cheaper. And obviously, medical services, childcare, that's service industry. And we can also see that line that is average hourly wages, which has increased quite rapidly, right? That's what we're looking at, 100%, right, over that period. And I think from that perspective, if you were to take that out, factor that out quite easily, so then ultimately hospital services would decrease, right? And then you factor in the computer software use increasing, and that should, all things equal, be deflationary, in my opinion.
Makes sense. Guys, I'd love to talk more, but I think, Thomas, you told us you have a hard stop, and I have a hard stop as well. We didn't talk much about crypto markets, I feel, or not as much as we could have. But super interesting conversation. Anything else that you guys wanted to talk about, or any shout out you wanted to give?
Just for 30 seconds, do you think the Bitcoin bottoms in? Thomas, yes, no?
No.
Justin?
I think it's a good time to average in, is my answer.
Okay.
Yes or no?
I'm going to call it. I think the bottom's in.
Yeah.
All right.
I think it just doesn't look the way traditional cycles look, and so I don't think the bottom is forming the way it normally should, and I think it's kind of it. But anyway, let's see. We'll look at this in 6 months or a year.
I hope I'm wrong.
Yeah.
Same.
Yeah.
Well, no, actually, I don't. I hope I'm right. But yes.
Although I love cheap Bitcoin, so maybe, hopefully I'm right.
Yeah.
Guys, pleasure.
All right, see you later, guys.